A brief history of the Earth, life on the Earth in geologic time. Your learning goals are to explain what fossils are, explain what relative dating is, and what absolute dating is. Let's watch a short video on the formation of the Earth.
Our solar system formed from a large cloud or nebula of gas and dust about 4.6 billion years ago. This cloud mostly consisted of hydrogen and helium that formed in previous generations of stars. This pre-solar nebula was a rotating sphere of dust and gas. Slowly, the dust settled around the central plane to form a disk. At the center of the nebula, a protostar formed. Further contraction in the heart of the protostar caused the temperature and pressure to increase until they were high enough for nuclear fusion to ignite. In the disk of debris surrounding the very young sun, heavier elements remained closer to the central star, whilst lighter elements were pushed by the solar wind to the outer regions. The dust and gas, whilst settling into a disk, started to accrete. Some material was broken down into smaller pieces, and others began to cluster together and stick. As these clusters grew larger and larger, they attracted even more material and eventually formed the planets observed today.
The early Earth was not a pleasant place. In fact, you might describe it as hell on Earth. It was constantly bombarded by meteorites, asteroids, comets. There were huge volcanoes spewing poison gas into the atmosphere. Most of the atmosphere was carbon dioxide. There was no oxygen. It was a terrible place. Life couldn't exist. But gradually, over time, the Earth began to cool off. The bombardment from outer space objects began to subside. The volcanic activity began to reduce. It gradually cooled off enough that liquid water could begin to rain from the atmosphere as it does today. There were huge thunderstorms and torrential rains. It was still too warm for liquid water to exist on the planet, so the water would immediately evaporate and go back in the atmosphere. But eventually, the Earth did cool off. Liquid water began to accumulate in the oceans. And if we went back in time to the shore of the ancient ocean, it might look very similar to this picture. There wouldn't have been anything alive. It would have just been rocks and water. But probably 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago, life began to evolve. The first organisms were prokaryotic. They had no nuclei, right? This may be some of the first living organisms on Earth. These are fossils that are about 3.8 to 3.5 billion years old, and these are thought to represent some of the earliest life on Earth. This is a fossil of a bacteria that's about 800 million years old, so a little less than a billion years old. So there's almost 2 billion years difference between this fossil and this fossil. As I said before, the Earth's atmosphere had no oxygen when it was first formed. So these organisms had to use anaerobic respiration. Within probably 1 billion years of the first life on Earth, bacteria developed the ability to do photosynthesis, similar to these bacteria that are present on Earth today. And they formed these curious structures called stromatolites. Stromatolites are layers of bacteria in sand that repeat over and over again, and they form these structures. They look like rocks, but they're actually mostly living. Now, we find these in certain parts of the Earth today. There are parts of the ocean that are too salty for anything else to live in, and that's where we find stromatolites. But at one point in time, stromatolites were the dominant form of life on Earth. If you were an ancient astronaut and you came to the Earth 2 billion years ago, you would have seen stromatolites in the shores of the sea, and these stromatolites were producing huge amounts of oxygen. And the atmosphere of our planet became rich in oxygen because of these bacteria. And once that happened, life could do aerobic cellular respiration, which, as we learned, is much more efficient than anaerobic, produces much more energy. There were bacteria present on the earth, and you know that bacteria don't have a nucleus, they don't have mitochondria, they don't have chloroplasts. However, here's how those organelles could have started. We have two bacteria living independently. One bacteria engulfs the other and eats it, but instead of this bacteria being digested, it lives on within this other bacteria and becomes basically an organelle. Both bacteria would benefit from this. This would be a form of symbiosis, mutualism, and when these two organisms reproduced, their offspring could have these organelles. It's thought that the mitochondria and the chloroplast were obtained, and the nucleus were obtained by bacteria in this fashion. Eventually, organisms became more and more complex. From bacteria, we moved to the protists. From protists, we moved to multicellular organisms. Unicellular organisms would join together and form basically a colony, and then from there evolve into multicellular organisms. And then sexual reproduction came about. And once sexual reproduction was developed, then the variety of Earth's life exploded very quickly and diversified tremendously. Within a few million years, we have these really complex organisms now. Not just bacteria, not just sponges, but things with claws and antennae and feet move around and capture each other. By a 500 million years ago, all the major groups of life on Earth had evolved. Animal life, that is. By 300 million years ago, there were large, ferocious fish swimming in the sea. There were no land animals other than insects, but plants had invaded the land, and there were forests and trees. Eventually, vertebrate life moved on to land. This is thought to be one of the earliest organisms that made the transition from living in an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment. Then the reptiles evolved, and from reptiles, then the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs, though, at one point had a very, very bad day. An asteroid is thought to have hit the Earth about 65 million years ago and created enough global climate change to cause the dinosaurs to disappear. Once the dinosaurs were gone, that gave an opportunity for mammals to evolve and diversify. These are some early mammals, some strange-looking things that by 25,000 years ago, if you were wandering around North America, this is the scene that you would have beheld. So that's a very short, brief history of the Earth and the life upon it. The next thing we need to talk about is geologic time. First concept we're going to touch on is called relative dating. If you looked at these pictures of these three females, you wouldn't have any problems putting them in order from the youngest to the oldest, right? It would be simple. And here we've done that. Now, we don't know the birthday for any of these people, but we definitely know that this is the oldest person, this is the youngest person, and this person is in between, all without knowing when they were born. That's like relative geologic dating. We're going to use evidence to help us put things in the order in which they occurred, even if we don't know exactly when they happened. So one of the things that we're going to use to help us is the idea that layers of rock go from the oldest at the bottom to the youngest at the top, if they're undisturbed, if they haven't been disturbed by earthquakes and things like that. So if we come across a group of rocks, we would know that the rocks at the bottom would be the oldest, then these rocks would be the next oldest, and then these would be the youngest. Now, you guys all know what fossils are, right? They're the preserved remains or traces of life that are found in rocks. They could be bones, they could be shells, they could be leaves, they could be tracks, trails, burrows. Doesn't matter, they're all fossils, right? Here I am holding some dinosaur fossils. I just have to throw that in there. Now, fossils can help us with determining the relative age of layers of rock because fossils are the remains of organisms, and organisms come and go in geologic time. Organisms evolve, and then they go extinct. Trilobites were extremely common on the Earth for a couple 100 million years. At this point in the geologic record, they became extinct. In this part of the geologic record, this type of a fossil, an ammonite, is extremely common, but there were none in this part of the geologic record, and there are none here. So fossils can help us in that way. If we find trilobites and we find ammonites in layers of rock, we know that the rocks with the trilobites have to be older than the rocks with the ammonites. So we can put these two ideas together and we can help determine the relative age of layers of rock. And we said that rocks toward the bottom of the pile were older, and that some fossils appear in the record for a short time and then disappear, and they're replaced by other fossils that are younger. So if we put these two ideas together, when we see layers of rock like this, we can begin to determine how old they are relative to each other. The fossils in the deeper layer of rock have to be older than fossils in the upper layers of rock. Another way we can use fossils to help us is because we know that fossils live just for a short time in the geologic record. If we find a layer of rock here that contains this type of fossil, and then we find some other rocks that contain the same types of fossils, we know that these two layers of rock were formed at about the same time. And we know that these layers of rock are older than these layers of rock because of the fossils that they contain. Another type of dating is called absolute dating or radiometric dating. This is different than relative dating. Absolute or radiometric dating gives us the actual year that the rock was formed. It gives us the rock's birthday. And it's based on the fact that radioactive isotopes or atoms in rocks decay in a predictable way over time. And if we look at the amount of decay that has occurred in the radioactive isotopes, we can figure out how old the rock is. Through the efforts of geologists over many years, the age of the Earth has been divided into a time scale. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. That's an enormous amount of time. It's so large that it's very difficult to compare it to anything that we experience in our everyday life. So one way we can kind of put the age of the Earth and the evolution of life into their proper time sequence and understand the vastness of geologic time is to compare the time since the formation of the Earth to right now to a 24-hour day, right? We have experience with days, hours, minutes. So we can compare the two and get some meaning out of it. If we say that the Earth was formed at midnight, it took until about 3 o'clock in the morning for the Earth to stop being bombarded constantly by space objects. It took until about 4 o'clock in the morning for the very beginning of life. And somewhere by 6 in the morning, the ability to produce oxygen to do photosynthesis would have evolved. and organisms would have produced oxygen and been very simple one-celled organisms all the way until after noon. Somewhere in there, multicelled organisms would have begun, and sexual reproduction would have evolved by around 6 p.m. in the evening. Once sexual reproduction evolves, then the speed at which life evolves increases rapidly. So by 9 o'clock at night, now we have trilobites. The dinosaurs would have come about around 11 o'clock at night, and people wouldn't have showed up until the last minute or so of the day. So that helps you put geologic time in perspective.